Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Just as some background as people are coming in, we've had this event scheduled now for several weeks. And of course, John Papa's computer decided to give up the ghost literally last night or this morning, is it, John?
20 minutes ago.
Yeah. And so John is going to carry this whole webinar on his iPad, which I think is a first for us. And so if this flops horribly, we'll reschedule and chalk it up to a learning experience. And if it succeeds, this is going to be John Papa's Michael Jordan flu game. So we're excited to have you all here. Just as a little bit of housekeeping before we get started, this webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending it to you after the event, to the email that you signed up for this Zoom webinar with. And so expect that in about 1 to 2 days. You can also go and rewatch it immediately after on our Twitter or YouTube channels. And also, we do have a full calendar of upcoming events that you can go find at pluralsight.com/events. And when you register for one of our Zoom webinars, you'll have a chance to give us feedback on what topics you want to see us talk about in the future. And that input is so helpful for us to put on events just like the one we're doing today. So again, visit pluralsight.com/events and then register for one of our events and leave us some feedback. So with that said, I really don't think I need to introduce our guest today. He kind of introduces himself, and if you're here, you probably know who he is. So I'll just say two things really quick. The first is that I checked John's Twitter this morning, and he is at 99.6 thousand followers. And I really feel like we need to get him over the 100 mark today. So there should be enough people in this event to get John to 100,000. So So go and follow John on Twitter. If you're a developer looking to skill up, John shares a lot of tips. He's always talking at events. It seems like everywhere in the country. So his Twitter profile is a great place to go be part of that community. So go follow him and let's get him to 100,000 today. And second, as you can tell from John's background, he's a huge Star Wars fan. So I'm going to turn it over to you, John. I want you to introduce yourself, but I'd love for you to start out by telling us how you celebrated May the 4th be with you this year.
Oh, well, thanks for having me here. And I love, this is some of my favorite webinars, to be honest. You guys always have it so together. And today I'm the technology deficient one with my dead computer behind my iPad. So yeah, I've been doing web development for many, many years. And the one big thing I love is that it seems like there's a lot of Star Wars fans out there in general, and they cross over with like web development and technology quite a bit. And I actually put a joke up on Twitter the other day. Seems that Disney is hiring Star Wars lightsaber wielders right now. And all you have to do is be able to act out being a Jedi, and you can go be with their new lightsabers. They have lightsabers that actually they'll actually glow out now. So I'm thinking of leaving this technology career and joining Disney to be a lightsaber wielder. That's how I'm celebrating May the 4th. So with that, I guess let's kick into, and as you said, the presentation today is all going to be in the iPad. The good news is this was going to be a very slide-driven conversation today. I've got a lot of code, but it's all in the slides as a backup. As a seasoned presenter, this stuff happens. So we're just going to see how this all goes for us. Now we're going to share my screen. If everybody's wondering, I'm using an iPad with PowerPoint. So you're going to see some interesting new icons, hopefully. There we go. So when I talk to Pluralsight about saying, what do we want to do about this Angular webinar? Instead of talking about advanced enterprise features or how to get started or a lot of the things that we've covered in the past, what I wanted to do is talk about what's new. And I want to hit this from a couple different angles. If you're like me, you could disappear out of work for a couple of days and you come back and you feel like your email box, Twitter and social media, everything's changing in technology way too often. So one of the things I like is to know what's new that came out recently. And then also, sometimes there's been features in the last couple of versions of a product, which maybe you just didn't know existed. So I'm going to spin on a couple of those different areas today to talk about that. We're also at a very good inflection point where Angular version 12 is coming out imminently. And if you've been following their changelog on their GitHub repo, you could see some of the new features coming. And if not, I'm going to share a lot of those with you today. So my name is John Papa, and I work for Microsoft, and I'm a huge Disney and Star Wars fan, as you can tell. And I really just love the web. So let's get into it and talk about what's new in Angular. So first of all, there's a bunch of debugging features that were introduced in Angular in version 9 and 10. And I want to cover what some of those are and some of the ones that are not even Angular specific that you may or may not be aware of that are really, really powerful to use. And then we're going to talk about what's coming in Angular 12, which is coming imminently or soon, like very soon. And then finally, some topics about what's coming in the future for us all. So we'll talk about first the debugging aspects. And there's two ways I like to split this up. There's the browser debugging, and then there's Angular specific debugging. So browser debugging techniques. First of all, you may have found yourself inside of Edge or Chrome or Firefox, and you're doing your debugging here. We all know where the sources panel is, and we can set breakpoints in here. But did you know that when you're in here, you can also use the file navigator to go around and find your files. You can use the code editor to walk through, explore your files, or like redesign it with prettier inside there. That's what those little curly braces do. And you can also use JavaScript debugging right inside of Chrome. So it's really, really powerful to be able to do this right inside your favorite browsers. And inside the code editor, there's a couple things I really rely on. The first one is right there. I always collapse the file navigator. And instead of searching through a hierarchy, instead, I like to search for the file using Command P on my Mac. And I believe it's Control P on Windows. So if you hit Command P, you can then pull up a list, which is what you're seeing in the bottom here, and you can do partial name file matching. So you can find everything that's got like -list.ts. And then you select that file and it'll bring it right up. And then just like inside of VS Code, you can close open files or go search for a file too. Now, breakpoints are great, but I also like inline breakpoints because we do a lot of asynchronous programming inside of Angular. So when we have async programming, sometimes we have comments or, commands that run together and you're not sure where to put the breakpoint because the breakpoint might be an asynchronous pattern or might be inside an observable with a subscription. So here's an example of using the OR operator. And over here we're saying, all right, can you deactivate as the function? And we're checking two different conditions first. And then if both of those turn out to be true, then we're going to run this modal service activate function. Now notice that that activate on the far right has got a breakpoint inside of it. So a couple things to look at. We're detecting if a name has changed on the screen. And if the name has changed, we should not be able to deactivate. So first we're checking, is there a speaker or not? Yeah, there is. It's right on the screen. Second, is the page dirty or not? Well, we changed the value, so it should be true. So first, what we do is we tap here in the gutter over by the 40 to set a breakpoint, and then you'll see a bunch of those little blue arrows kind of faded out. They're kind of translucent. And then you can click on one of those blue buttons to make sure that that blue button breaks up a breakpoint. And that's what you're going to see over here on the right. And as an added bonus, even though I've got Do Not Disturb on, if you follow me on Twitter, you're going to see your name pop up on the screen, it looks like. So right over here on the right-hand side, you can see we can tap on the activate. And what happens is that breakpoint will not get hit unless the first two conditions are true. And because it's asynchronous underneath, it's not actually going to run that third line unless those first two happen, which is kind of cool. Now, once you're inside of there, you get the standard buttons, which are right inside the same window down at the bottom. And I just blew it up here so you can see them. Over on the left, you get your continue button to run through debugging. You've got your step over, you got step in and out. You've also got disabling breakpoints. I do this a lot when I've got a bunch of breakpoints, but instead of getting rid of them, I just want to turn them off for a minute so I can run through the code, and then turn them back on. And then, of course, is the break on exceptions. This is super cool because if I'm running through my code and I'm getting an error message, but the error message is 18 levels down in a call stack, instead of actually tracing through that, I can say break on an exception. In the first place that exception occurs, it'll actually stop the code for me so I can see what's happening. So I find I use this quite a bit. And then inspecting with the console is really cool too. So let's say I'm broken at the same line of code. What I can do is open the console. You can either click right here, or you can use the escape key, which actually pops it up. And then you can run a function. So I'm broken at the modal service.activate. So I can run a function called isDirty. I wanted to see what was the result of this .isDirty. And it came back with, yeah, the name field is dirty. And it only works because I'm stopped at that line of code. If I wasn't stopped at the line of code, isDirty would be out of scope. And because isDirty came back as true, that's why we ended up coming into the activate. Now, a couple of things you'll see me talk about is the console quite a bit. There's a lot you can do in there. Now, everybody uses console log, but did you know there's other great features that you can use in the browser? So console object has a bunch of these, and you can use emojis like pizza or party. And I do this a lot, actually, for logging out. So everybody knows you do console log hero.name. But what if you want to do an error message? You actually want to show the error message in a different color, for example, or you want to filter by errors. You do console error. You can also do console count. If you want to find out how many numbers of times a specific thing has been called, console count will increase it for you in the console window. And then my favorite is console table. Console table will take a list of data or an object and print it out into like effectively an HTML table inside the console window. I find this incredibly powerful, especially when I'm getting back a list of data from an HTTP call. And a lot of times I use emojis in these to kind of differentiate. Have you ever written console log messages and you're doing it that you are here or now you're at this point? You kind of make these messages so you can debug through and figure out where you are. Sometimes I use the emojis to tell me, is this an incoming call or an outcoming? And I use an incoming arrow or an outcoming arrow for it. Or if it's an unhappy, if it's a happy thing that's happened, I'll use a happy face. If it's an error message, I'll put up like a exclamation mark or a warning sign with the emojis. So the emojis can help you when you're debugging. Speaking of HTTP, one of the things I like to do is detect and pause on specific XHR calls. So here, I wanted to make sure that I could break on a specific call to my API for heroes. So what I did is I put a pause on that specific API. Now, how do you know if you're going to break on which HTTP call? Well, that's down here, where inside of the window, you can set up in debugging inside the browser on a URL that contains what? So I put a matching partial URL right inside the browser, and anything that's going to API heroes is going to pause and break. So then we can set watches. So inside of, I'm using Chrome in this case, but it works with Edge as well. I use both of those quite a bit. We can set a watch here, and you'll notice this watch, it's hitting my breakpoint. And then what do? I can go ahead and I can set a watch on this .editing hero, and I can actually see the values of that show up as I'm going through the code. So kind of zooming in on the scope there, you can also see the scope of the code here. We've got scope window. We just pop into that instead of watch, and you can see all the variables that are local to the scope that you're actually looking at. Now, this is really nice because sometimes you think that there's a property in an object, but you're not quite sure. So it kind of gives you an idea of how to get there pretty quickly, or you can change values right through here too. I also find it helpful to look at this state as things are changing in my application to see that I actually update the object I think I updated. Now we're going to try something new here. I'm actually put a video together. This is my backup of how you can set conditional breakpoints inside of Chrome as well. So we're going to make sure this works. And we'll see if the video actually kicks off. It looks like the video is not going to work, but I will make sure we share this deck out and you get the links to it. So what we can do is we can set conditional breakpoints inside of the browser where the breakpoint turns orange, and it only works if a certain condition is true. So I can say only break if the isDirty flag is true, for example. And this one, I'm sad I can't show you here on the iPad, but this is also a video. It's useful call stacks. How many of you have been debugging your Angular app and you're breaking a line of code and you want to see where the error really happened? And you look at the call stack and you see like 30 different calls. And about 25 of them are code that's like inside of RxJS internals or inside of Angular internals or inside of Zones internals. And you're like, that's great, but I don't really want to look at that. Well, what you can do is you can turn off all of those or hide them. It's called black boxing. So there's a feature inside of Chrome and Edge, inside the browsers, where you can enable and black box certain calls in the call stacks and say anything to zones or RxJS, for example. Let's just hide those. And then my call stack will only show my code inside of the browser. And you can always turn those right back on if you want to inside of a setting inside of your browser. So again, I'll share these two videos out later at the end of the with the deck as well through Pluralsight. And go to the next section. So I kind of whizzed through those because those are all Chrome and Edge debugging techniques or Firefox. But those have been around for a couple of years and the browser is constantly improving. And that's what I use to debug quite a bit. It really helps. But now I want to show you some specific features that Angular has for debugging as well. Now, all of these have been around since version 9, which is about 2 years ago. Currently, we're on 11 and 12 is coming out. And they're about on a 6 to 9 month release schedule. So let's take a look at what we can do in Angular. First, template errors. The template checking has gotten a lot better inside of Angular. And the whole thing is, how do you make sure that your templates can have no errors in them at all? Well, in Angular 9, there's this IB compiler that's been coming out, and it's now out. It's improved all the template checking for us, and we can do things like enable strict templating. So this allows us to really check to make sure all of our templates are much more robust. Now, the key is in your editor, like Visual Studio Code, you want to make sure you're using the language service extension, which you can get from this link right here. So how does this work? So you're going to see errors the first time you turn this on that you didn't even know you had. A while back in Angular, before this existed, if you had a situation where you had like a customer.address.city property, if you're inside of an ng4, it was not very good with Angular and the language service to be able to tell you if you spelled the third property in that. You got customer address and then city. If you spelled city wrong, if maybe it was city address, it wouldn't tell you that. Now with strict template checking, it will. It goes all the way down. It'll also tell you if you have improper function implementations, like you call the function incorrectly. So here's an example of an error you might see now with strict template checks. Here inside this component, it's saying that, oh, wait a minute, this function is not assignable to the track by function, which is a hint that is in the ng4. And now you'll notice here, the track by function I'm calling is track by hero. But the track by hero is looking for something that's expecting both a hero object and an index. And it looks like I didn't pass one of those in. So I can go fix that. And then model properties is another thing we can look for. So notice here, I put in hero.capital ID. Well, it's actually lowercase id. I did that on purpose to kind of show where this was, but it's showing now where when you've got properties that are dotted inside of your templates, whether they're in an ng4 or an ngif or not, it'll actually tell you right inside the message what you did wrong. So this is in the console window when I build Angular, but it also works inside of VS Code with the Angular language service. So here's the example of how I fixed that track by. I had this code in my code for a while. And then when I went over to Angular 9 and I turned this on, the strict template checking, now you can see that the index should be passed first. So that was the correct way to implement the function. And I had a bug for a year without knowing about it. So you can also inspect Angular in the browser. You can do things like debug the current state of your app. You can use the ng namespace variable. You can find more out about this at this link here, and we're going to see how some of this works. You've got to be in development mode because all this works only when you don't do a production build. But what could you do? So let's say you're inside the browser again, and you want to run to see what's going on with your current, at a breakpoint with your current code. You can use $0 or $0 and ng. $0 gives you the currently selected DOM element, which is very cool. So then you can run a code like this and say, okay, go get me from that element in the DOM, get me the context of it for Angular, which means go get me the hero component, maybe on a heroes page. And then maybe I want to go get the component that owns that, that's the parent to that component. I can actually go up the chain by saying, get the owning component of hero component. So now I've got the hero component and I've got its parent component called heroes component. And then I can just say hero component.hero.name, and I can look at the properties. So I don't have to inspect the DOM so much. I can go through the DOM to get the Angular elements and look at it and inspect anything I want to inside the browser, which is incredibly powerful when you're debugging. Okay, so that's looking at elements. What about changing or calling functions? So we can do that too. Let's say you want to change values. There's a function called apply changes. You just pass the component's name to this apply changes when you want to call it. All right, so where might this work for you? Imagine we had the code before, and now we're changing the hero's name to Madeline. Here we set that up, we changed a model. We're going to notice it didn't actually change. If we look at this comparison now of the hero component Madeline and say, is it equal to the fourth one in the list from the parent component, we're going to come back and see, what's the value. And those values will be different, but what's on screen is not yet reflected. Why is that? That's because it changed detection in Angular. So we changed the model, but there's no change detection running when we do this. So we have to tell it to do that. So then we can call the save hero function in my code, which imagine that goes to HTTP and saves the hero. And then finally, we say, okay, now apply changes. It effectively kicks the change detection into gear and says, now go ahead and update the UI using Angular. So it's really powerful that we can actually test things out right inside the browser to make sure things are working the way that we expected. Oops, and we've got some links there. That's a bad slide, sorry. So now we get past some of the debugging. I want to look at what some of the new features are in Angular 12. Now, these are pretty cool. All this stuff is public knowledge. If you go look at the GitHub repo and scan through their issues and PRs and their change logs, but I try to put together a list of some of the most popular features I think you're going to be interested in. Standardized errors. Oh boy, this is great. Everybody gets errors at times. Angular now has a list of runtime errors. That's what the R stands for here. And these are right in the docs. And you're going to see these standard error messages for things like no provider found. You're also going to see compile time errors, things like missing tokens or invalid elements. Now, there's a certain format to all these error messages and how they work and what you can do to learn about them. Here's how it breaks down. And this is right out of the Angular docs. The error code is on the left. Then you get a message and then a link. So right here, the W is for the different types. The runtime is 0, or it's a compiler error, 1 through 9. Then the X, that green part, is going to show you what kind of a category is it. Is it an internal issue, a template issue, a styling issue? So that's what that number will mean. And then the third section there is the index code. And then after that, we get the error message, which is a string, and then a link. And the link will bring you right to the Angular IO errors page in the docs. When you click on that link, it'll go right to the page for that specific error, which is basically the screen I just showed you before this. And in some cases, there'll be a video up on YouTube, which they link to, which explains in about 2 to 3 minutes what the error is and what you can do to resolve it, which I find incredibly powerful. So you can just click on those video links when you get those errors now inside your console, and it'll tell you exactly what you did wrong. Another new feature is that the Angular team said that they started looking at how many people were creating strict mode by default when they created projects. And I believe the number I heard from the Angular team was like 70% of people. So they said, why don't we just make this a default then? Because strict mode does what I mentioned before about increasing the type checking and showing you more errors for things. It's not as loose. Well, you used to have to say -- strict to do that. Well, in Angular 12, you won't have to. It'll be turned on by default. So strict, welcome to Angular 12. So how does this help you? Things like strict templates that we already talked about, injection parameters. It also enforces all of TypeScript's strict mode as well. The big thing for me is it's going to help you with future ng update commands. As you're all aware, there's an Angular CLI, and you can upgrade one version to the next by running ng update. Well, it does a much better job if all your code is running with strict mode, because it can then determine what has to actually change for those changes, and you won't introduce new errors. I talked about the language service a couple times, so let me hit this again. Inside of a template and explain kind of what it does, you're going to get improved IntelliSense. So this will work whether it's in separate files or in the same file, like a single file component. So you're going to get better syntax highlighting. You'll notice I have a template right inside of my TypeScript file. And it works whether, again, it's in the file itself or a separate file. So here, as I do a drop down on hero name, I'll see description, ID, and name, and I can select those. Now you'll notice I could actually, my font's moved, sorry. You'll notice that I've got the hero name here. I'm going to go back one slide to show you again. Look at the hero name in the top and look at this title string inside the movie component. I can get more specific now. I can say, you know what, hero, it might not be there. So therefore, I want to make sure this is an optional object. I try to execute hero.name if there is no hero. And title, I want to default that to string. So we can actually get more specific with our templates right inside of the components now. The language service will help us do this. Another thing I really like is inside of Angular 11 and prior, it used to be the default, and it's no longer is, where when you run ng build, you had to specify -- prod. In Angular 12, it's going to change. ng build will run production by default. Why is this important? Well, when we're in dev mode, think what we do. We normally run with ng serve. We don't ng build and run it. In dev mode, we normally run ng serve. We crank it up with Webpack. We make our changes. We get that fast dev experience. When do we run ng build? Mostly when we're about to commit or run unit tests or put up in a CI/CD and kind of push it off to a server. And for those, we want production, which is the bigger, deeper build. Well, the problem was, what if you were running to Netlify or Vercel or Azure Static Web Apps with Angular? If by default, you ran the normal npm run build command or just ng build, it was going to build a dev experience build and push that to a web server. Why is that a bad thing? Well, the average dev build for a small application like the Tour of Heroes can be 5 meg of assets in a dev build, 5 meg. So you push your 5 meg app up to a web server, whereas the production build might only be like 80K because it trims all that out with tree shaking and so on. So people, and myself included, saying me here, a lot of times would run that build and it would push it up to a server and it'd be 5 meg instead of 80K. And all we had to do was turn on production. It would solve the problem. Well, now we don't have to make that mistake. So now we have production builds by default. So you get faster by default on things like Netlify, Vercel, and Azure Static Web Apps. We can also do things like inline Sass. So inline Sass is pretty cool because now inside the templates, you'll notice I've got my HTML up here, but I've also got things like CSS that I can run. But now I can also add Sass. This only works in version 12 forward. Before, in version 12, if you put Sass inside your inline styles, it wouldn't compile the Sass parts at all. So this is going to really improve that single file component experience that we have. And this would look something like this. So now we could use styles right inside of here, and those styles would just use all the features that we normally use. All right. It's not proceeding. Let me check here. There we go. So we can use those inside of V12 for single file component experience. Another cool new thing is that TS-lint used to work really, really well with Angular, and it was great. But the problem is that ESLint kind of took over where TS-lint was going. And it didn't make sense after a long time that we had TS-lint and ESLint, since the TypeScript team now has adopted ESLint as well. So what do you do? Well, now, thanks to James Henry, person in the community who's developed this, we can automatically add ESLint into our Angular library just by running this command right here, these two, creating a new project there. And what it's going to do, it's going to help you use ESLint directly inside of Angular. And again, thanks to James Henry and friends for doing this. It's a library up there in public on GitHub. It's a great community contribution. And we're doing this because TS-lint has been deprecated as of almost 2 years ago now. Those of you out there who like CSS and like things like Tailwind support, it's now supported with version 11.2 moving forward. It's great. There's actually a great video up from ngconf, which was 2 weeks ago, up on YouTube. You can learn more about this. What you do to use Tailwind now is you can install it directly in your app, running npm install for Tailwind CSS. The -d means development. And then you create your Tailwind config.js file in your project root. And then the Angular project, the build system, will automatically just include Tailwind. Why is this new? Like, you could use Tailwind before, but it was more work. Why is that? If you're not familiar with Tailwind, what Tailwind does with CSS, it pre-processes it. So it actually looks through the code before the build process. So because of that, now we've got the Angular build system is automatically aware of where that Tailwind config file is before it runs, which is pretty cool. There's a bunch of other new features. I'm going to highlight just a couple more to talk about here, but you can check out more in the blog post that I'm sure will be coming out. Critical CSS and font inlining is now part of version 12. This is going to make the browser experience on first load much faster. Why is this important? You can always Google these features, of course, but what critical CSS is imagine you're loading a website, you're a user looking at it, and you are not seeing that website come up quickly because there's so much CSS loading. Well, what Angular would do is it'll take the critical CSS, the parts it knows it needs to render the page, it will inline into the page, so it's not actually downloading a second file. Same thing with fonts that are critical to the app. So it'll actually make those things come first, the parts that are critical, and give it a faster user experience. Webpack 5 is now being used by Angular 12, and this is important because it's going to make the bundle smaller and faster, because Webpack 5 has some new features coming out, and once those are implemented, Angular will automatically benefit. You're getting improved messages. We've seen error messaging already. The CLI has greatly improved the messages as well and trimmed down some of the noise that's in there. So you'll see a lot better messages when things go wrong and when things go right. Another community contribution was there's the min and max form validators. So you can now use these as part of Angular as well. So when you're using Angular forms, there's now validators that'll work for minimum and maximum values. And a highly requested feature was this HTTP request metadata. So you can do things like inspect the request to get the full metadata to find out what's being cached or not, and then influence how your HTTP is actually being cached using things like interceptors. And one thing I really want to focus on is request voting. So if you want something in Angular, I mean, they have hundreds, if not thousands of issues inside of Angular, right? Big product, lots of community. If you want to work on features and you want to see them in the future, they have now defined a new process where you can actually vote on the features inside of GitHub. And based upon community feedback and that voting, that's what they're going to consider working on first, which is really, really good. So it's not just going in and adding a comment saying, I want this. There's actually a voting process that they're trying to use so they can help prioritize what's coming in future versions. And the last topic I want to talk about is less Angular. And I did a lightning talk on this topic at NGConf, and I wanted to at least address this here because I think it's really important. Angular is a very opinionated, guided framework. And it allows you, as the pros of that, to always know what's my path to getting from zero to production. But because it's very opinionated, there's a lot of things baked in. Again, it's good side and bad side of that. Because all these things are baked into Angular, like dependency injection and HTTP, RxJS, you kind of know where you're going to go, but you don't always need those things. And all those different concepts, like decorators and injection and things like that, they add to the cognitive load of learning Angular. We don't always need all that stuff. Like, do you always need an RxJS subscription when you're getting your HTTP data? I'd argue that you don't always need it. Sometimes you just want to call the data and get it back and you're done. So a couple things are going down the road with this, possibly in the future. We're already seeing single file component support, SFC. And for those of you who might be thinking, gee, single file components, why would you ever want to do that? We want to separate our concerns. Our concerns are HTML, CSS, and TypeScript. Well, I'll tell you this, separation of concerns is not separation of files. Let me say that again. Separation of concerns is not the same as separation of files. Think about why we separated our files. A lot of times, frankly, it was because the files were not supported by the tooling. So when we started with web development years ago, we didn't have great editors like Visual Studio Code. We were using tools that couldn't support Angular language services. It didn't even exist. So how are you supposed to combine these things? It was just much easier on the tooling to separate. Another thing that happened was we didn't really have this wave of componentization. What I mean by that is we now take components, we try to split them into small as possible components and use those components to compose applications. And the result of that was we used to have these really large components with thousands of lines of code. Now we have much smaller components. So by keeping in one file, first of all, the tooling supports it. Second, you can take an application that's got 100 components and 300 files, and now you have 100 files instead. So you're reducing how many files in your app, which mentally to go through an app and maintain it, now I can see 100 things instead of 300. It's easier. It also means less folder structure to support that. So you don't have that expansion. And for me, the big thing was this. When you're inside your file in single file components, I'm constantly editing the CSS, the template, and the code at the same time. If I have to do that in 3 files, I'm constantly flipping back and forth between the files, and that's not really great for my productivity. And you might be thinking, yeah, but we've always done it this way. If you look at Vue, React, or Svelte, 3 of the arguably other competitors out there in the web framework world, they all use single file components, all of them. React is a single file for JavaScript. Vue, they've got the SFC down with their files as well, the .vue files. Svelte also does this. And that's kind of where everything else is leading towards. So Angular is moving forward with this, with more support in the tooling. And today you can do everything you need to do in version 12 with Sass. If you don't use Sass, you could have done this in version 10 or 11 as well. The second thing is optional NG modules. There was a time where we needed these, but there's actually a lot of progress moving towards where I could see, this is not in there yet, I could see where the Angular team is already making proposals and considerations for removing NG modules or making them optional. It wouldn't be a deprecation type thing. It's more of a, if you don't want them, here's another way to solve the problem. Because if you think about modules and what they do, what they're really doing is helping with lazy loading. You could still do that with routing. They're helping you with having, telling where the declarations are for your components, like what's in this module. You could use a component to do that. They're helping you with providers. We could use components to do that as well. So there's other ways we could accomplish this and have one less thing in our application. Because again, you look at what's out there in the other web frameworks, they don't have this concept. It was invented by Angular to solve a problem that existed 6 years ago. So it's the evolution. I could see them going off. Zones, it's been talked about for a while now about possibly getting rid of zones or making those optional in Angular. And then just less Angular overall. And you might think, yeah, John, we're not going to get rid of those things. But look what's already happened. Angular just announced that Protractor will no longer be supported out of the box with Angular. And they're considering what they're going to do in the future. Or maybe just support third-party stuff like Cypress or Storybook and other things like this. So you can have different options for third-party. ESLint is now taking over for TSLint. We can now do Sass inline and do SFC instead of MFC. So a lot of things that existed don't necessarily have to be the way we do it forever. Just because it was doesn't mean we can't evolve. And I mentioned HTTP. Did you know that you can do everything you need with HTTP by using a tool called Axios, which is a third-party library? It supports all the HTTP calls, works on all the browsers. Most of the other major web frameworks generally use that by default. And you can use HTTP interceptors with Axios and never actually pull in the HTTP client library with Angular. Like, why does Angular have to have HTTP? It's something that everything needs, right? It's not an Angular thing. And if you don't even want to pull another library in, you can use the fetch API inside the browser. Works great. And I'll give you a link to a demo at the end of this that shows you how to do that. Another thing to think about is if you use fetch or Axios, you don't actually have to pull in RxJS. So you can make your HTTP call and say, async await my HTTP call, I'll get my data back, and I'm good. So if you're struggling with RxJS to get out of the box, or with a team that's just getting off the ground, or frankly, you're just writing an app that just needs to go get data and bring it back, and you don't need all that RxJS offers, you could simply just use promises. So there's a lot of cool things I could see coming to Angular where optionally, if you want to, there could be less of Angular to learn and still get all the full features that you get today. Now, I promised that I'd give you a demo of this. This is the demo I was going to show you today, but it's all up in GitHub repo. And it obviously doesn't run well on my iPad. But when you pull this down on your machines using VS Code or WebStorm or whatever your favorite editor is, go check this out. It's called Angular What If. And there's 2 projects in there, one called MFC for multi-file components and one called SFC for single file components. And you'll see some of the differences between those inside of there. And I believe they're both using Axios to show you how you can do this. And as a special bonus, there's no dependency injection, none at all inside of the, no services, no providers inside of the SFC application. Why is that? Just to show you that you can write the app without it. And I would argue that in some cases, it's actually a little bit cleaner. So imagine yourself in the future, maybe future versions of Angular, having optional dependency injection in providers. And wait a minute, let's think about that. When you learn Angular, you learn components. We'll still be doing that. You learn services, HTTP client, decorators, what those decorators mean. You learn RxJS. You learn class structures. What if you didn't have to learn all those things? Instead, you just learn components and you just write JavaScript with functions. If you take a look at that SSC project inside of this Angular What If, let me know what you think. Put your comments up on Twitter, and I'd love to hear from you now when you're in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, John. This was really helpful. I can tell that the reception is really good. Just both from the audience, but also we didn't have any major technical difficulties. I think that's worth celebrating. So just as a reminder to those watching, we will be sending a recording of this to you, to the email that you signed up for the event, and we'll make sure to get you John's deck with all those demos and videos as well. John, maybe to start off, Matthew had more of a comment. He said, "I'm so glad someone with clout is saying less Angular. I've been arguing this for several years now on my teams." Do you want to add any more color to kind of how important it is to have that kind of conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that there's other people out there who feel this way. Matthew, I believe, is one of them right there. But also on the Angular team, there are people who feel the same way as well. So this is not like the Angular team I've dropped something on them that's been like, oh my gosh, what is he talking about? There are people in the Angular team who've been thinking about this for a long time. Just because they don't verbalize it doesn't mean it's not there. With that said, there's been discussions for a while that me and other folks from the community have had with the Angular team. And that's why you're seeing these topics like optional NG modules, optional zones that are being considered. It's also why things like ESLint with the deprecation of TSLint came about. It's also why we can do things like using fetch inside of an application with Angular and use SFC. So I think the problem is that we all get into this mode of, we love Angular, and I love it. And we love the features that are there. And just because we get comfortable using a tech and knowing where it is, sometimes we forget how hard it was to get up that hill in the first place. If we go back 7 or 8 years, I think, using AngularJS, the biggest reason AngularJS was so popular was because it was so easy to get started. Everybody could jump into it. Now, it's not Angular that's hard, it's all the stuff around it. So when we start peeling away the pieces we no longer need for building applications, that ramp becomes super simple again. And to me, it gets Angular back to, wow, I could show this to anybody and get them started right away. So I'm really passionate about this, and I'm really glad to see a positive reception.
Yeah, that's great. So Brandon asks, when passing objects to an NG template, is there a way to tell Angular the type? I find I get lots of compile warnings about type checking. I know you can create a cast method on the component, but it seems odd to add code that will execute at runtime to fix what is actually a compiler issue.
I think I'd have to see a specific example, because I don't think I've run into that, because most of the time when I pass objects to components, like a hero object, those are already typed for me. And then the strict type checking, if you turn on strict type checking, it will automatically catch those things at compile time or dev time for you. So I had to see more specifics. Feel free to reach out to me or to the Google team up on Twitter. You can just tag @Angular and @John_Papa.
Another attendee asked have the language service improvements enabled single file components with Sass, SCSS, or is it CSS only still?
So in version 11, which is the effective current version today, you cannot do Sass in line. But with version 12, which I've hinted several times today is coming imminently, you will be able to do Sass with a language service with Angular 12. inline components.
That's great.
It is great. I've been waiting for that for years.
So Thomas asked, and I'm not a developer, so I'm probably going to botch how I'm supposed to say this, but he said about Angular strict templates, do you have recommendations on how to manage the strict typing errors that pop up from OBS $/async, which types the event as T-undefined? If that made no sense to you, John, you might want to just go look in the Q&A panel.
No, I get what he's saying. I'm not sure if I've got recommendations on how to get through that. That would be one of those things, honestly. It might be one of those cases where if you can pull a reproduction together of how this works up on StackBlitz, which you can just create on stackblitz.com, a quick repro of how this works, and then you tag either me or the Angular team up on Twitter, we can take a look at that and work through it. When you're getting specific errors like that, it's a lot easier to look at an example, and then we can see, does the strict template checking actually work for you in that case?
So Tony had more of a comment, maybe if you want to comment on this. He said, I actually like the class structure and DI. Coming from a C# background, this makes sense to me.
I think that's great. And that's why it's all optional. So for me, I came from C#. I actually prefer functions in JavaScript just because I felt there was less to deal with. I'm not a big fan of, I've never been a big fan of object-oriented inheritance, but I do like composition, like implementation of interfaces. So there's no reason you have to get rid of classes. My personal favorite is I like classes for components, but for services, I just want a list of functions. Most of my services don't maintain state. They just go get data, they manipulate data, calculate information, etc. And to create a class for that with functions to me felt like overkill. When I create Vue and React and Svelte apps, I create a JavaScript module with a bunch of functions. I export those functions and I import them where I need. But to me, it's great that we're going to have choices now. So you can do it either way. It's just that when somebody's learning this stuff, now we have options. And I think that's the new thing here we're introducing in Angular is I'm trying to make it okay for people who want to use classes and use DI to do that. And just as okay for people who want to write functions and don't want to deal with DI to do the same thing. And do not disturb does not work on the Mac or the iPad. I can tell you that right now.
We're learning. This is a first time experience. We're learning. So Kate asked, can you please give an example of what kind of code to run outside zone?
That's an interesting question. So personally, I don't like the idea of having some codes running in zone and some code not, because it makes me have to then think about it. I'm waiting for the world of, I'm going to run zones until I have an app where I can run the whole thing without it. So what needs to be in zones, or in general, anything that's got something to do with change detection. If you're manipulating something that's going to end up on the screen in some way, you want the zones to be able to capture that. If there's code that doesn't have to do that, you don't have to run it through zones. But it really gets kind of quirky to me. So it's hard to give you a specific example for that stuff, because maybe even though what you're modifying isn't updating the screen directly, maybe it's indirect. So I'm really waiting for how can we get to a world without the zones at all? Otherwise, my personal recommendation is I still keep them on.
Yeah. So it looks like we have about 3 more questions before we get to the end of our time. So Daniel asked, well, first Daniel said he really appreciates you taking the time today, John, and I want to echo that. And then he asked, for those of us who have to package our Angular app with a monolith and have the tooling to debug locally, can we build with source map and still take advantage of A9 plus debugging?
Still take A9. Yeah, so I think what you're asking, Daniel, is can you take advantage of the new Angular 9 debugging features and you still package with source maps? Yes, so the source maps will still work that. The key is if you want to use the NG feature, for example, that I showed in the debugging, you need to do a development build. There's certain things that get included with Angular when you do a development build, besides not getting rid of all the dead code and stuff, making the bundles as small as possible. There's certain Angular features that get bundled with a dev build so you can do the debugging. If you do what you do is do a dev build with the source maps turned on, and that would probably get you what you need.
So someone else asked, I work for a large company that creates a large number of Angular libraries that are pulled into a number of Angular apps. Migrating to a new version is a very large task. do you have any suggestions on how to handle this efficiently? For example, can our Angular libraries multi-target versions so we can upgrade end applications as we get time?
Yeah, this is one of those things where it's, if I was still consulted, it'd be a lot of fun to sit down and go through it all with you. Because I worked at a company that had lots of libraries that my team created. And the version control is always fun. General recommendation would be to have the libraries. First of all, when I do the upgrade, ng update is great. I always make a new branch. I always commit my changes first, and then I run through to see what actually needs to be updated. And I do it through step-by-step make commits. I do my regression testing before I actually merge it in and pull it. Now, you can take a library that's written for a new version of Angular and run it with an older one as well. So there are ways you can do that too. But to make the cross-version compatibility, it does work, but it definitely requires regression testing. So if you have a large matrix of those libraries and your apps, I'd want to make sure that every time I upgraded my libraries, maybe I've got a dozen or 5 dozen of them, I'm regression testing against at least a core set of the applications to make sure that they still work. And ng update should handle most of that stuff for you. Now, if you're trying to run Angular 12 against Angular 2, I'm sure there's going to be problems. But if you're running 1 or 2 versions off, it shouldn't be a big issue.
Awesome. So Bruce, this will be our last question.
Okay.
Bruce said, I'm looking at the Angular what if repo SFC services. How can unit testing work with globals? We typically mock our services, but how do you do that when you have global services imported?
That's good. So it's not technically a global service, right? It's an imported JavaScript module. So you could just use, there's a lot of JavaScript libraries. Names are escaping me because I don't have my computer. It's black screens right now. But there's different libraries you can use to mock JavaScript modules where you just replace those with a certain interface API. So maybe you've got a service that gets data, you want to mock it so you don't actually hit the HTTP calls. You could just pass that in, create a mock library for it, and then have it set up their mock return values. So it's a similar process to what we do with Angular. It's just with Angular and DI and services, some of that stuff's handled for you in the baked in library. But the JavaScript world at large has lots of different mocking tools that you can use to do that.
Awesome.
Great questions, though. It's new, right? We haven't thought of these things before because it's like Angular does this out of the box. But the funny thing is the entire ecosystem has handled pretty much everything Angular does. Like, did you know you can actually use dependency injection with Vue, React, or Svelte? You can. There's libraries that do it. Same thing with RxJS.
Awesome. Thank you, John, again for your time. For those that kind of joined late, John had to do this entire thing from his iPad because his computer went kaput today, and I think it worked really well. So we learned a lot. Someone said that do not disturb only works when the iPad is locked. So there's that last little piece of knowledge for us today. John, do you have any final takeaways before we end this webinar?
Yes, always have a backup for every presentation if you ever go into a meeting. That's what saved us here, because I think it literally died at 20 minutes before the hour. So
awesome. I think that's as good a piece of advice as anything you've shared even about Angular today. So